Panel today is focused on climate policies and COVID-19. And we'd like to explore this topic, especially from the perspective of what climate-related policy actions have been taken in recent months, what possible impacts there are from the COVID-19 pandemic on climate or the environment, looking at possible parallels between climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, and what this all could mean for us as we're trying to respond to climate change in the future. So now I'll pass it off to Greta to introduce our panelists.
And since we know that this is a topic that's pretty multidisciplinary in nature, we want to reflect that in the expertise of our panelists. So we're really happy to have, going from left to right, Dr. Christopher Galik, who is a professor here at NC State in the Department of Public Administration. And then we have Dr. Chris Weaver, who's a physical scientist at the EPA, and also the head of science integration at the US Global Change Research Program. And then our last panelist is Mr. Andrew Freedman, who is an editor at the Washington Post and who has been covering climate policy as it's related to COVID-19. So thank you all so much to you guys for being here today. And if each of you would just like to give a quick 2-minute introduction in your own words of the work you do and how it kind of relates to climate policy and how it's been possibly impacted by COVID-19, that would be great. So I guess if Dr. Galik, if you could start us off, that would be awesome.
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here, filling in at the last minute. I'm happy to speak to this. So obviously I'm here on campus, so I'm doing a lot of work primarily in the teaching and research space, but I started my career in DC and spent about a decade at an environmental think tank down the street at Duke, working to try to directly leverage existing science to the policy process and also flag policy needs for the researchers to think about as they approach their work. And so that's a perspective that I still bring to the work that I do. What's the policy relevance of this? So in terms of what I actually research, I'm interested in energy and environmental institutions. We can think of institutions as these formal and informal things that influence human behavior, including hard and fast things like laws and regulations and rules, and also more informal things like norms and other cultural signals. I'm particularly interested in how change happens in the context of existing institutions and how you can layer on new things to what's already there. So that's like a fairly portable question. So I've used variations of that in a number of different arenas, primarily in the climate mitigation and adaptation space. So for example, how can you make use of existing programs in agriculture to encourage greater carbon sequestration by farmers without necessarily passing new laws? What are the gaps in energy storage policy at the state level pertaining to new innovative technologies like energy storage, and how can experiences in other states nearby be leveraged to fill those gaps? Who are the relevant decision makers best suited to facilitate both mitigation, think climate mitigation like carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, and adaptation, things like increased resilience in the built environment? How do the priorities of a new presidential administration interact with existing private sector actions to blunt or accelerate changes in greenhouse gas emissions, either by way of increasing them or decreasing them? So it all comes back to the central idea of how does policy fit into this broader institutional context?
Great, thank you. And now Dr. Weaver, if you could give us a little bit about what you do.
Thanks very much for inviting me, and I'm really pleased to be here. I always enjoy interacting with the Global Change Fellows here. Yeah, I'm Chris Weaver. I'm a climate scientist by background, and by practice, a little bit less at the moment. I sort of started out as kind of an academic, pretty garden variety academic climate scientist. I was a professor at Rutgers for a number of years, but switched over to working in the government sector, number of years ago, embarrassingly large number of years ago. I guess I did a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship and landed at the EPA and have been there ever since, working on, how climate change intersects with kind of EPA's core mission, air quality, water quality, ecosystems, public health. During the last presidential administration for about 4 years, I was kind of loaned out from EPA to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the US Global Change Research Program. And so up until about 2015, I did a bunch of things there, including ultimately being the acting director of the US GCRP, kind of in the time period of the third National Climate Assessment and the Obama Climate Action Plan and those things. I'm back at EPA now and, still working at that intersection of science and policy. And, I'm really interested and excited about the topic of the panel today, particularly these questions of, kind of the interrelationship between, COVID, the pandemic, and climate change, the sort of similarities and some important differences in the kinds of problems that they present to society, and as kind of examples of science and technology mediated sort of societal problems. But I think that, the COVID pandemic illustrates in, sort of an accelerated way, a fast forward way, a lot of the same kinds of dynamics that we see with climate change. And so, and the fact that we're now going through this may have implications for the way we view and respond to climate change over the longer term going forward. And I'm definitely, I'm most excited to, certainly not excited to hear what I have to say about it, but I'm very excited to hear what my fellow panelists have to say about it. I'm really hoping for insights, and also from all of you from the discussion. So and then I guess, if there's time, I'm happy if folks are interested in, sort of sharing thoughts about, I know all of you are thinking about a kind of diverse array of careers coming out of your Global Change Fellows program, and that might be academia, it might be government, it might be journalism, it might be policy. I'm happy to speak to those issues as well. So thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think there's some nice continuity that each of our panelists have some sort of tie to the nation's capital. And Mr. Freedman, our last panelist, obviously does as a reporter and editor for the Washington Post and their weather blog, Capital Weather Gang. So if you'd like to take it away and give us a little more perspective about what you do, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I am currently dealing with a wildfire in Colorado, so that's part of my job. We cover weather, climate extremes, climate change in general. We work with the climate team here at the Washington Post very closely. We just published a story that I've been working on for a month on the North Complex fire and the impacts in Berry Creek, California. So a lot of what I do is kind of like the here and now, what the impacts of climate change are now and how things may change in the future, and trying to avoid the use of commonly used things like the new normal and, all that. But I've also been I've reported in initially on like the potential links between COVID and seasonality, what people thought might happen in the summer, what could have happened in the summer if our policies had been better, and what they think may happen in the winter just in terms of the seasonal cycle of COVID. But something that I've been thinking about, that the climate team has been thinking about much more deeply, is how does this downturn, this economic downturn, affect emissions trajectories? How does it potentially play out in international climate negotiations? We're seeing, a lot of other countries cooperate on vaccines. We are not. We're seeing China lead on their pledge for 2060. You can argue whether that's a very significant pledge or not. And we'll see what happens in 2 weeks, I guess. But, not like, as a reporter, the whole campaign's been exhausting so far. So, I deal in kind of different timescales, and COVID has so many weird parallels to climate change in terms of the ramifications all over the world, but also in terms of denial, in terms of like science and the way people are reacting to it, especially in the US and some other countries compared to other places. So there's fascinating psychological aspects to it as well. So I'll stop there and let folks continue.
Sounds good. Thank you for that perspective. Yeah, I think already our speakers have brought up some great topics, and I know our audience members are probably itching to get some questions in. So we just would like to know a little bit more about the audience then. If you would please answer the poll that will be popping up in the chat soon about like kind of your role or who you are from the audience member, that would help us. And I think our speakers get a good idea of who's all here today. So just, yeah, start answering that. And then we'll begin with some of our panelist questions.
Not surprising that we have a lot of university folks.
Yeah.
We've got a good mix from a couple other places at least. Okay. Here we go. Thanks for running that poll, Ambar. Okay. Great. So we are, let me get the poll out of the way there. So yeah, great. Now that we know a little bit more about you and our panelists, we're going to jump into some questions that we have prepared. And like I said, we definitely want to hear from you a little bit later. Sorry, this poll keeps popping up in front of me. So we're going to start by considering, I guess, and we've kind of already touched on a lot of the things that we want to touch on today, but I hope we have some more to talk about as we go on. But I think we want to start off by talking about what has happened with climate-related policy since the COVID-19 pandemic has begun, and potentially what has, also happened outside of policy, potentially within, the environment and possible climate impacts related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's not a surprise that the current administration has taken numerous actions on environmental and climate-related policy throughout their tenure so far. But there've definitely been, several notable changes in policy since the pandemic began. And to not go into a whole lot of detail, but the EPA has relaxed a couple of different emissions standards since the pandemic began, and suspended some enforcement of some emissions reporting without really much of an end date in sight for that. There's been, renewed discussion surrounding the transparency of science that should be used in making environmental regulations. And, there's also, on top of this, we're observing a lot of interesting changes in the environment and possible results of climate change as well, kind of like what Mr. Freedman touched on with the fires that we're dealing with right now out west. But, we've also seen some things that are lightly related to the pandemic response and could have impacts on the state of the climate. Like in some places, we've seen some brief periods of improved air quality, especially when commuting has gone down. But we've also noticed, especially recently, there's been a global increase in methane hotspots, despite potentially a lower demand for energy right now. So, there's a lot of different aspects to consider since the pandemic began, but we're hoping to get a little bit of your perspective, each of you, on what you think is maybe the most impactful climate action or potential environmental impact that has occurred since the COVID-19 pandemic began. So let's start with you, Dr. Weaver, since bringing in your kind of climate science background here, what do you think might be one of the most impactful either climate policy related actions or potential impacts on the climate because of this pandemic?
Yeah, well, and you touched on, really a number of different aspects, probably most of them. I mean, I think, in terms of, direct policy actions aimed at climate mitigation or adaptation, say, I think mostly it's been kind of, the effect of the pandemic has been somewhat negative in the sense that, just in a very kind of practical sense, it's kind of taken up bandwidth, resources, time and energy, pauses in research and development, provided, an excuse or a backdrop, let's say, for pausing, in progress kinds of environmental actions that might, have some kind of effect on climate change. And so I think, I think in the immediate term, there hasn't been a lot of good for, in terms of, by good you mean forward progress in climate policy. But I think there are a lot of pretty complex and sort of less direct intersections between, this kind of current pandemic moment and climate policy, and in particular, I think in the sort of unintended consequences or, hard to foresee consequences for, this transformation that we're sort of squeezing through as a society right now, getting through this pandemic for, what the future response to climate change might be. I mean, I think that you could make a strong argument. We can, certainly go into that, I think, and some of your other questions might create a space to go into that in more detail, a strong argument that we are maybe fast forwarding some of our attitudes, necessary to more seriously tackle climate change in a number of different dimensions, whether it's the sort of, there's a kind of awareness of a number of different things that I think will be critical for kind of effective long-term policy. You mentioned the natural experiment that we've run of stopping commuting and seeing, really seeing literally with our eyes, the really, really major impact of humans on the environment, in the US, but even more strongly, I think, in parts of the developing world, where there's a lot of air quality issues right now. The kind of tug of war with scientists and politicians, and I don't think the politicians have come out as well as the scientists, in sort of those public skirmishes. What does that say about the kind of prestige of science, going forward, that could be leveraged for other issues like climate change and so on. And then of course, some of these, these really, really thorny issues around, individual actions for collective good. We're running experiments with things like masks and, personal behavior that scale up into something that has society-wide, global impacts, exactly analogous to, many of the sort of keystones of climate policy. So, we're in a little bit of a laboratory right now for doing the kinds of things that, will be called for various types of climate policies, whether you're talking about mitigation or adaptation. So, I'll stop there, let my colleagues weigh in, but, those kind of indirect dimensions, I think are looming large and may ultimately be much more impactful than this sort of short-term pause in climate policy that we see as a result of the pandemic.
Definitely, that's some great insight there. Mr. Freedman, would you be willing to offer some thoughts next?
Nope. No, I'm just kidding. You said something about like fast forwarding our attitudes in ways that might be more amenable to tackling climate change. The past 2 years have been, even before COVID, things were sort of fast forwarding in public opinion on climate between the youth climate movement kind of percolating ideas on the Republican side that weren't coming out into the open too much, but were happening behind the scenes. If you get a Democratic administration, I think you're going to get a bipartisan bill of some sort. Whether it's effective or not, I couldn't tell you, but there's agreement on certain things. And there's a social movement there that there wasn't a couple of years ago. And this is something that, like, I'll give credit to Gore for constantly telling me, which was like, action will happen when there's a movement to make it happen, rather than just with academics saying you need a $40 price, you need this cap and trade system, or, because we saw legislation get passed and then those people that voted for it get pushed out of Congress. I just think there's now like a realization, how do I put it? I talked to my little brother who's in his mid-30s, and he's a stay-at-home dad, and he has a very different perspective on things than I do politically. And just he's, I think, thinks like a lot of younger people right now, and a lot of older people too, just in terms of how the deck is stacked against certain people and how messed up all these things are, and how the economy just seems to be Wall Street, not Main Street, and how systemic change needs to happen in order to tackle climate change. It's not about, changing light bulbs and all that stuff, because he sees me covering, what I cover day in and day out. And I think people like him are ready to vote for people who support things like the Green New Deal, as practical, as dead on arrival as it may be politically. There's been more of a push and a realization that systemic change is needed on to solve certain problems. And that's both building back better from a COVID perspective. Although I think Build Back Better is a Biden campaign slogan, so I might have absorbed that somehow from watching too many things. But just saying, like, there does seem to be more of a recognition that something systemic needs to change rather than just things on the margins. And that wasn't there even during the Obama administration when they were doing a Clean Power Plan and putting through what they thought was systemic change. Now we're talking social justice issues. We're talking about bringing in a lot of other aspects. So yeah, that resonated with me, like the increased willingness to consider bigger things.
Definitely, yeah, those are great points. And last but not least for this particular topic, Dr. Galik, what do you have to add?
So I would just agree with what was said about larger systemic structural change. For me, the thing that I've observed isn't necessarily a policy, but a lesson for future policy. And particularly somebody who's interested, like myself, in the response of people to these formal and informal cues, whether those are like market signals or policies or cultural norms. This lesson on the behavioral change that's led to emission change during the pandemic has been really instructive, that we've had this massive disruption. And there was an estimation in a paper that came out in May in Nature Climate Change that was on the order of 4 to 7% below 2019 levels. So fairly massive disruption, I would argue, for a fairly minor drop in emissions. And that really calls into question, what can we change behaviorally kind of at the end of the process to affect these emissions? I haven't left the house personally much at all, other than to do some shopping and occasionally take my daughter to daycare. I don't know when I last finished or put fuel in my car, but I can tell you that when the pandemic is over, those behavioral changes are likely to snap back. That You know, I'm looking forward to getting out with my family again. There were family trips that we put off. There's youth basketball that we want to get back into. And so all of those things that we've adjusted to that may be leading to smaller footprints at the moment may come roaring back. And so how can we change the system? What are the policies that induce this broader change, not simply forcing fairly immediate and dramatic change to achieve a few percent bump relative to the previous year's emissions? That for me has been really informative. Again, because this is something I study, and there's a lot of discussion in the literature about what can people do from a behavioral perspective. And certainly there is stuff to be done, but the magnitude of the challenge and seeing what it takes to achieve these measurable changes, I think has been really instructive for me as somebody who works in this space and has frankly experienced some of the hard choices need to be made to really bring those emissions down.
And then also going off that, Dr. Galik, I guess, do you also look at kind of which communities are impacted the most from kind of, from an environmental justice perspective, either by the climate crisis or now compounded by COVID-19 and the climate crisis?
I can't speak personally. I can speak of what I've observed and what I've read, but I myself count myself as at this moment fairly fortunate to be in the station that I'm in, that I haven't had to confront personally these challenges. But I think what I've observed is that we see similarities in whether it's a so-called K-shaped recovery, where you have certain individuals of certain means doing better, and those without those same means and access to resources doing poorly in COVID and after COVID. Same problems in climate change, where you have certain individuals that are going to be facing the brunt of this, some of whom can have the resources and means to see themselves out of it, but then you have other things like so-called blue lining. Are there going to be places where simply because of future risk of natural disasters, sea level rise, where you get certain individuals, certain communities that are essentially trapped and unable to buy themselves out of those challenging situations. So I think that in both situations, you're seeing the potential furthering of these inequities, both in COVID and in climate change, that those who are least able to weather the storm, pardon the pun, are those that are facing some of the greatest challenges. The other thing that I think becomes challenging is that some of the preferred mechanisms, at least in past policies, like cap and trade, these market-based policies, tend to be very efficient from a aggregate market standpoint, but can still result in localized hotspots. So you may have, on the whole, greenhouse gas emissions falling, but the facilities that are still left operating and potentially putting out harmful pollutants may still be in areas of disadvantaged communities. And so how do you take these efficient mechanisms like cap and trade that work at broader levels and still build in these localized, but what does it mean for this one place where emissions are not going down? And how does that interact with the broader suite of things we're trying to do at a global level?
And then how do you kind of handle that discrepancy, I guess, like from the EPA side, Dr. Weaver, or do you at all?
Well, I mean, I think that many of the same, and Dr. Galik just spoke to this, many of the same sort of, you take a stressor, a kind of society-wide stressor like COVID or climate change, and it surfaces these fragile aspects for particularly vulnerable populations, right? It sort of accentuates these distributional effects. So, I mean, the kind of disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color, people of lower socioeconomic status, I mean, it really parallels the kind of environmental justice issues that we have with respect to pollution, historically, and now with the impacts of climate change, in areas of higher risk. And so, you see what you see are kind of the expression of these effects of existing inequalities, and the lack of a kind of a safety net. I mean, we see the lack of kind of an economic and healthcare safety net in outcomes with respect to COVID. And, I mean, certainly we don't have there are populations and then internationally countries, that suffer from the lack of kind of a climate safety net, like that can't move, can't relocate, but can't really safely shelter in place either because they don't have the infrastructure to do that. So, again, there's some very similar kind of dynamics at play with respect to climate change on a longer, more drawn out time scale. For certain kinds of problems, maybe it's the life of a mortgage instead of the duration of a business cycle. But also those timescales may be coming closer together. I mean, they may end up touching, and just take the wildfire season that we're having now, or the hurricane season that we're having now, and you're overlaying that on top of the pandemic, and these impacts are interacting in real time now, and so. I mean, I don't want to like prognosticate about, like how does the EPA transform, and this is probably the point in the conversation where I should make clear, looking around for the hidden microphone, that it should make clear that, like, I'm speaking for myself, obviously not the institution, but we've been pretty successful with a kind of like top-down command and control sort of regulatory model for controlling air quality, improving air quality, water quality, and so on. But, EPA has always been a little bit of an awkward kind of sandwich of a regulatory agency on the one hand and a kind of public health, public welfare agency on the other one. And the kinds of things that I think are going to be eating our lunch, over the next decades are going to be things where, maybe we'll have run out of regulatory levers to deal with wildfires, as an example. And we might need to be pivoting more to being a sort of agency that offers, evidence-based kind of public health guidance and information and communication and so on. And I think that, in the realm of, environmental justice as it relates to climate change, we're probably going to be informing these next generation of mechanisms to, how do we install a safety net? How do we buy people out of, poverty so that they can escape the impacts of climate change and so on.
Yeah, and then touching on this like really extensive wildfire and hurricane season that we've been having, Mr. Freedman, have you interviewed any subjects that have been like personally, impacted by some of these natural disasters, and then on top of that have had to deal with the COVID-19 restrictions?
Yeah, I mean, we've encountered that pretty much every fire that we've dealt with, every hurricane evacuation. The choices that people have are different than in a normal hurricane season. FEMA very much tried to steer people towards hotels for shelter rather than big community shelters. It's a little bit more chaotic when a town, like what happened last night, is evacuated in the middle of the night, whereas the fire wasn't anywhere close to there. When people went to bed, they just go. But yeah, we've talked to you, and my colleagues have talked to many more from the scenes and the communities that most closely affected. But yeah, it's interacted in ways we didn't anticipate, but in some ways it's actually been a little bit less of a nightmare than we thought it could be. Possibly because we didn't have a hurricane like, nobody remembers like hurricanes the way, like a weather reporter does, but like We didn't have a Floyd along the East Coast. We didn't have a Hurricane Ike in the Gulf Coast, a massive storm not making up its mind, threatening some of the most populated areas. We had really unlucky, rather sparsely populated and poor counties in Louisiana get hit over and over like there was just a target on their back. And those people are really struggling. And I'm thankful that both us and the Times have continued to tell their story. But yeah, I think definitely.
Yeah, this is, it kind of leads into a little bit of what we wanted to talk about, I guess, in the next portion of this is, I mean, first taking a little bit of a step back, it's clear that the global response to the pandemic itself has been varied. Country to country, people are kind of handling this response differently. And even within the US, from state to state, and even with where you have large cities versus, more rural areas, things are going to change a little bit. And I think, kind of thinking about these parallels between, the effects of climate change and what effects COVID-19 has had on different communities in some of these ways. What do you think we can, learn in terms of a lesson towards approaching, climate change and the pandemic, or either one, since they're both, like you said, kind of pandemics happening concurrently. Dr. Galik, what kind of things do you think we can piggyback off of what we might be hopefully learning right now in terms of what we can do as we move forward?
That's a pretty heavy question. I think I'll echo some of the things that were already said, but reinforcement of global institutions is absolutely necessary. Both global pandemics and global climate change are very difficult to tackle if you're going it alone. And I think there's been some weakening of those institutions. And so figuring out what works, whether it's the institutions we already have, be it the UNFCCC or the World Health Organization or what have you, trying to figure out how to make those things operate so that we are truly able to address these global challenges in a somehow tractable manner as a global community. The other thing that I would take as a lesson would be that that planning and preparation were sorely lacking in both cases. That we could foresee a global pandemic, we could foresee the sorts of things that climate change is contributing to, whether it's fires, more intense rain events, things like that. But we didn't get ahead of them like we should have. Maybe this changes that calculus, that it becomes much more of this isn't a hypothetical thing anymore, but rather this is what happens if we don't prepare. I think that there's a huge opportunity in this recovery, whether you're as was mentioned, building back better, that campaign slogan, or if we even just look at the obvious parallels between the post-Great Recession American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that came out in 2009 and Joe Biden's work regarding that. It was billed as the largest single investment in clean energy in history. So if there's a way that, and again, this all I think hinges on what happens in a few weeks, which trajectory kind of we take, but I think there's an opportunity to, at this point, really make a lot of movement on one side, or try to figure out how to do things differently given where we are and the tools we have on the other. But what I keep coming back to is somebody who's interested in stability and change, that opportunities for taking a 9-month pause on a global scale in an election year with the second largest emitting economy that doesn't happen very often. And so it really is this pivotal moment of where do we go from here? It's kind of like a choose your own adventure book where you get to the end of the chapter and this is kind of where it goes. But I do think coming back to this idea of global institutions and reinforcing those and getting ahead on this planning and preparation, because we know what the risks are. We know how they're going to manifest. It's just a question of what do we have in place to deal with it when the thing actually happens.
Right. And I mean, Dr. Weaver, you kind of touched a little bit on this in some of the discussion you had previously with Greta, but do you have any other thoughts on, I guess, maybe more lessons in a way?
Well, just picking up on one of the points that, that Dr. Galik made, I think that, our sense of invincibility, it's got to be a little punctured, right? I mean, we have this thing that happened that's, only, let's say 10 times more deadly than, a seasonal flu or something like that. And it's shut down society. I mean, how close we are to the tipping point with, some sort of external disruption, I think is, whether we'll sort of remember that, post hoc or not. I mean, I think that, something really bad could happen unexpectedly. And we know that now, we've experienced that. And it's not just, doom mongering. It could happen on the climate front as well. And so, and that idea that, we can see something and we can even plan and have plans in place, but not be prepared. Maybe that kind of pathology is punctured a little bit. And I guess the other point that, thing that I would add is, we're going to need, this is maybe sort of the flip side of, the building back better kind of thing. We're going to need some new ways to generate revenue, I think, right? This whole experience has been pretty expensive. And, I mean, already it's kind of back to Andrew's point earlier, there already was some shifting in approaches, sort of bipartisan thinking about, climate solutions. And, tax and dividends, was certainly part of the conversation, raising revenue essentially through carbon taxes. Maybe that becomes even more popular. Maybe we're holding our noses and saying, well, we need money. We're not necessarily that psyched about taxing individuals, but maybe we can, put in place some kind of revenue generating scheme involving carbon taxes. I'm not an economist, I may be totally like off base there, but, I've heard some interesting discussions along those lines. Is that a way that we can, we look at clean energy or climate policy as a way to, a way to save and then even possibly generate money, because now we're in such a debt hole as a result of COVID.
Definitely something to consider among everything else. And Mr. Freedman, I mean, I think you have a really interesting perspective, especially being on the ground and seeing things that are kind of impacting folks now alongside COVID-19. So what do you see in terms of lessons we should potentially be learning from these pandemics as we kind of move forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that point that Chris made about pierced our sense of invincibility is a big one. I think a lot of people, myself included, have wondered what disaster it's going to require to get certain policies to potentially happen or to get things to shift. I don't think that's what it's going to be. I don't think it's a fire or it's a super typhoon or a Katrina or something like that that's really changing things. I think it's a broader recognition and then a social movement that's looking at this through multiple lenses and seeing this climate change play out in people's backyards on a daily basis. But I don't know. I mean, our perspectives, like I'm looking out office window in our home office. It's a bureau of the Washington Post, since my wife, who sits next to me, also works at the Post. I'm like, well, this is what I've looked at for however many months, is just like this one view out the window. And the world seems so much smaller, yet so much more interconnected at the same time. And I think there's a sense of the fallibility of institutions that were meant to, this will seem disjointed, but I worked at a newsroom at Mashable when they built up to become like, compete with BuzzFeed in legit news. And we built a global newsroom, and then money ran short and new investors came in and wanted to completely change gears, and they fired the top 30 editors and one day and just changed course, closed bureaus, etc. And I learned from that how long it can take to build something and how quickly something can be destroyed. And I think what we've seen in this administration, through reporting and through other means, is how quickly you can lose confidence in things, and how quickly programs can be broken down. And I never thought I'd see the CDC fall so quickly. And I never thought, I mean, maybe I should have thought, but I didn't think the WHO was going to be quite the way it's been. I covered Ebola, and I probably should have called that, but I didn't think that these two institutions were going to have such problems for political reasons and other reasons. So, I guess that argues against like a big top-down, UN mandated solution, perhaps, and a ground-up type approach. And maybe governors have the right ideas and mayors have good ideas, and I'm not sure. Those are some of the things that I sort of think about, but while I'm purchasing like different masks because I can never find a comfortable one, or all the weird things that we do now that we didn't used to do several months ago. So yeah.
I guess we have some questions rolling in from the audience now. Also to you, Mr. Freedman. I don't know if you're able to see it in the chat, but this is a pretty extensive question from Adam Tarando saying, do you think your reporting influences political reporting at all? One of my major frustrations is that you can have absolutely essential investigative reporting on topics like pandemic and climate change, but at the same time, the top stories on the front page are often political or horse race stories. And so he's saying, are you getting through to the journalistic gatekeepers, I guess the editors, yeah, I guess what kind of is your agency there in putting forth? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, in that the Post and the Times do put climate change on the front page of the printed paper, and we do put it on the top of the homepage. It was on the homepage yesterday. The Colorado fire is somewhere on the homepage right now. We do have a homepage Slack channel where editors can lobby for stories and be annoying and basically say, like, this is why this is a big deal. But, a climate editor goes to bat for the climate stories with the national editor and with homepage people. And so, yeah, I mean, look, coverage of the Trump administration has been essential and has brought us many different pieces of knowledge that we would never have had. But at the same time, I think a lot of critics of the press are correct in that our ways of thinking and our ways of doing business were not prepared for such norm breaking. And kind of exploited some of the ways that we do business, just the way we think about things, and the way we think about news and what leads. So I think it can be frustrating to readers sometimes, but I think that we're catching on to things more and thinking about things more. But yeah, I do think we're putting these stories on the front page a lot more and featuring it on the homepage a lot more. So I've been happy about that.
And then hopefully we can get in one or at least two more of these questions. For all the panelists, Jennifer wanted to ask what elements are needed for a Green New Deal to result in lasting change. Please talk about equity and economics as well as carbon reduction. So perhaps Dr. Galik, you could start us off.
This is a final exam question if I've ever seen one. Man, I'm sweating a little bit here.
Typical
No
Jen.
pressure.
A really good question, right? And so when you look at the first New Deal, FDR's New Deal, it was in response to economic calamity, a lot of environmental aspects running undercurrent to that as well. So I think the biggest barrier to making it effective is getting it into place in the first place. I mean, we could see this in the first debate between the president and the former vice president of both trying to pin and then disavow the Green New Deal, right? Like, so it itself is its own thing at this point. I think that what was said earlier in the conversation, and Chris, I think it was you that mentioned it about the House of Representatives and the previous legislation in the Senate, Lieberman, Warner, et cetera. I would say not necessarily transactional, but very much here's what we're going to do. Here's the structure of the policy that will be set up. Here's how it'll operate. Here's how you'll approve this offset. Very, very mechanical, but it does really feel like between not only the conversations in the climate space, but broader social justice space, really does feel as though there is a broader systemic need for something to give. And so I think that his history shows that when these things finally do give, they tend to happen fairly quickly, that you tend to get a long run up to something and then a snap. It's not always the case, but oftentimes does. And so I think it's just, and I teach a class in policy process. I can't predict this stuff, but I do think that the conditions are being established for creating one of those points at which there will be the mobilization for and the demand for systemic change that will bring along with it not only climate related things, but broader social justice elements as well. That's if history has a parallel that we can draw here. I feel bad that I'm kind of punting on the question, but I really don't know. And I think if the answer is out there, that those far above my pay grade are the ones that hold that.
I don't know if we're running up to the time here. Unless you guys have anything you'd like to add to that question, I'm hoping we can get to this last question from the audience because it hopefully ends on a positive note. Elise asks, we recognize that climate change needs to be tackled from the top down, from the systemic bodies. How can we as individual citizens do more when we have come to this recognition? How can we remain positive, keep feeling like we are or can make a difference? Any thoughts for us on remaining positive?
Well, I mean, I think that, just the first thing that comes to my mind is, I think the point that Andrew was making about, what's different now, on this issue compared to a few years ago is it's the existence of a movement, and I mean, that's, it's individuals and it's broader. I mean, I think it's part of the reason why the movement has been powerful and effective is because it is broader than, simply the kind of environmental issues or the sort of narrow policy dimensions of climate change and sort of, really structured around values, particularly values, espoused by one generation, looking toward their future. You know, and so, you know, I agree with Andrew. I think that that's probably moved the needle more than anything else, you know, more than any sort of like, you know, white paper issued by, you know, Brookings, you know, or whatever, that, you know, somebody's looking at and like, how do we turn this into a piece of, you know, legislation? You know, and I think that that, you know, the individual or groups of individuals still, I think, really matter in dictating the kind of value base, you know, the terms within which, you know, these kind of policy questions get adjudicated politically. You know, and I think this is really, you know, to a degree that I think surprised me. I think just in a few short years, you know, that the existence of that movement has changed the conversation. And so, you know, leaves me optimistic.
Just to leave folks on a optimistic note, as I watch pictures of Colorado turning into night at what is it, 1:13 or 2 o'clock out there? I don't know. Well, two things. When people ask me what they can do, you know, I'm a reporter. I don't donate to candidates. I don't openly support candidates. All I can tell you is vote. In terms of optimism, I think that some of the energy of the youth movement and some of the smart folks that are involved in climate policy now versus 10 years ago, and the ideas they have and what they're focused on is really interesting and really inspiring. And, you know, watching Greta become such a phenomenon over the past couple of years, and others like her in many different parts of the world, has been really interesting, and has moved the needle in ways that just weren't moving before. And I think we saw there's parallels with the civil rights movement, there's parallels with other movements as to like, when did policies actually get in place? What were the prerequisites? And now we have COVID, which is like a bigger problem, but also parallel problem, but also an opportunity in the sense of where do you put all this money that you're going to put into the economy, and how do you build in a smarter way? So I'm optimistic. I would like to get out of my house. So there's that. And I'd like to stop covering constant climate related and weather related disasters, but I don't know that that's going to happen, you know, anytime soon, other than switching to a different beat. So yeah, there's optimism and there's reality, and I'm sort of tempering the two in the final message.
Dr. Galik, any last thoughts on that?
I would just add that, and maybe getting back to this last question on the chat that I see here, and that's recognizing the importance of what is going on, whether it be at the local level or at the city level, or even individual businesses that are going beyond the required elements of whether it's renewable energy generation or greenhouse gas reduction. But the fact that we are seeing some bottom up, we're still in campaign related to the Paris Agreement. Not only is that, I think, providing some needed action on climate change, again, going back to climate change, it provides opportunities to learn from what everybody else is doing, this laboratory of democracy kind of thing, but it's also can be incredibly empowering. Sometimes when you're dealing with a top-down thing of you just respond to the policy, that's something that can be effective, but it can also be very empowering when you're seeing the seed of change happening in your community, whether it's, you know, at the city or state level, and those things are moving, that there are some things that are still moving, and those things are amenable to pressure as a local voting citizen or as a consumer. And so I take heart in that. We did some work a few years ago trying to plot out the next few years of saying, what does this new administration look like for climate? And one of the interesting findings was there's a lot of stuff that falls outside the federal government's power to change. And a lot of those directions are actually moving in a greenhouse gas reduction way. And that was kind of surprising to actually take stock and say, there's a lot of things that they don't have the power to affect change on. Now, of course, we aren't bending the curve down, but we are expecting a curve up. And what we found was probably going to tread water for a while because of the inertia of these other efforts, the private sector, the local decision-making, individual private landowners and how they manage their land, things like that. So I think there's both, again, this idea of optimism, but also there's so much more to be done.
Great. Well, thank you all again for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Please join me in giving them a virtual round of applause for being with us today. Let's see, we have recorded this seminar and we will have a video link to share with all of the attendees, and it will be posted on our Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And we also would like to plug an upcoming seminar. It's in 2 weeks on the topic of disaster recovery amid the pandemic. So a little bit of foreshadowing in our topic today for that. But again, thank you so much for showing up. Greta had to run out early to get to another class. That's why she's no longer with us. But we really appreciate you all showing up and sharing your thoughts. So
thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation, and great job moderating, both you and Greta. It was really excellent. So
thanks. This was something new and different for me personally, but it was a lot of fun, especially having such a nice multidisciplinary panel. This is great. And thank you for being adaptable.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It's great meeting you virtually.
take care.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.